Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Quick announcement. If you pre-ordered the Freaky Folklore audiobook like I did, the listing has disappeared. I'm sure it will be back up, but I have no idea what's going on, so your patience is appreciated. Do you remember all those creepypasta about rituals and certain games or rules you have to play by at certain locations to experience something particularly disturbing? I ask because, do you remember the elevator game? What if it was real and someone tried it and the results lingered? Well, today we might just find out what happens. In today's first story, when an elevator repair crew stumbles upon something far worse than an unruly machine. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and I'm here to share a brand new set of true scary work stories with you, all of which have been submitted by listeners like you. Send your true scary work stories to me at eeriecast.com/submit so I can narrate them on this show. By the way, I'm currently taste testing coffee for the possible Dead and Roasted blend. I'll keep y'all posted. These are tales from the break room. The elevator game is real. From Johnny S. When I was little, like a lot of other kids, I wanted to be a cop or an agent when I grew up. Something about solving cases and helping people in need just filled me with that giddy feeling, like I would be someone important later in life. But things change, and childhood dreams quickly disappear and get drowned out by other more important matters. If you told little me that I would be stuck working on old elevators for a living, I would probably start crying. But that was my reality for a long while. I was fresh out of high school, and I needed money. I never thought I'd end up working with elevators, but after my school days were over, I didn't really have many options. College wasn't on the table for me. Too expensive, honestly. I didn't even know what I'd study. I searched for jobs through newspapers and such, but I didn't get very far. I was lucky if I even got an interview. Then a buddy of mine told me about an opening for an apprenticeship with a small local elevator service company. The pay was not amazing at first, but it was steady, and if I stuck around long enough, I could get licensed and earn much better money. Besides, it beat flipping burgers or doing back-breaking construction work. Now I'll be the first to tell you that elevator work can be stressful. Most people think it's just fixing stuck doors or pressing a few buttons, but there's more to it. Way more. You're working with heavy machinery, old wiring, greasy pulleys, and sometimes standing on top of an elevator car that's dangling by cables you pray have been inspected recently. A lot of the job is just preventative maintenance, like checking safety brakes and greasing tracks or swapping out worn rollers. But you also get called out when things go wrong. When people are trapped inside, you better believe everyone's looking at you and expecting you to pull off miracles like you're some kind of hero. Thankfully, the most I had to do in those situations was just opening a jammed door once or twice. Since I was just an apprentice, most of the dangerous stuff was technically supposed to be handled by my boss, with me soaking up the knowledge and wisdom. My boss was a guy named Richard, and let's just say he really was a Richard. In reality, I was the one who got sent into the cramped spaces, the dusty control rooms, and the half-lit basements where the old motors were kept. Richard mostly stood by the panel or barked instructions from above. I didn't mind too much, though. It was my first ever job. I figured that was just how apprenticeships worked. Do the grunt work, learn the ropes, and maybe one day you'll be the one yelling at some poor kid to fetch tools, if you're lucky enough to open up your own company. For the most part, the work wasn't that bad. The hours could be a bit weird, especially when a call came in late at night and a whole building was panicking about being trapped. But there was some strange satisfaction to it all. Hearing the gears hum to life again after you fixed a jam, or seeing the look of relief on someone's face when the doors finally slid open. I was starting to settle into my new life, thinking that maybe I'd found my thing. It was consistent. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore after working there for a better part of a year. Until the job downtown. That day in that old office tower, is when I learned that sometimes elevators stop for reasons no repair manual can explain. The tower wasn't anything special, at least not anymore. You could tell it had its glory days back in the 60s or 70s, when it was probably considered one of the better places to work in the city. But by the time we got called out there, it was just another half-empty office building. The lobby looked tired, the wallpaper was peeling near the baseboards, and the fluorescent lights flickered like they were on life support. We got called in because the main elevators were acting weird and had stalled the day before. Nobody got stuck inside, thankfully, but the tenants complained increasingly that it would randomly stop between floors, that it would sometimes open to a brick wall instead of a hallway, and that one tenant was taken somewhere else. That last part got a laugh out of Richard when the building manager told us. "People panic and exaggerate when they're stuck. Happens all the time," he said, brushing it off. "Still, the elevator's out of service, and it's our job to figure out why and bring that tin can back to life." With a quick look and nod of his head, Richard sent me down to the basement first, while he talked with the manager. Every building like this has its guts hidden in some concrete hole below ground, with dusty breaker boxes, humming generators, the works. I carried the heavy tool bag down the stairs with me, and instantly regretted not bringing a flashlight. The manager said not to worry since the lights are still working down there. And they were, but only for the hallway and first offshoot room. The basement stretched way further than I expected, with pipes running along the ceiling and the distant hum of motors echoing somewhere in the dark. The air was stale, like the place hadn't been touched in years. After a bit of walking down the hallway, I found the old motor room tucked in the far corner. The machinery looked ancient, with massive steel gears and thick cables coiled like spaghetti everywhere. I sighed and set the bag down, crouching to check the relay box. I traced the wiring with my gloved hand. Everything looked worn, but thankfully not damaged or faulty, at least from the outside. I was about to reach into the bag when I heard something that I definitely shouldn't be hearing. The elevator, moving down to my level. The manager said it was forbidden to residents to use it until we fixed it, and I was sure Richard wasn't dumb enough to take it down himself. I mean, we locked it down from the panel upstairs before I came down. But clear as day, I heard the cables tightening and the gears shifting. That elevator was moving, slow and steady, like it was making its way down. I froze watching the cables, listening to the groan of the metal. Then it stopped, not at the basement and not at the ground floor, just somewhere in between. And if that wasn't enough to get my heart pounding, the next sound did. A faint knock from inside the shaft. At first, I thought I imagined it. The knock was so light, it could have been a pipe expanding, or maybe just the echo of the machinery settling after the elevator stopped. I held my breath and waited. But then it came again. 3 soft, deliberate taps against metal. Not frantic, not desperate, almost like someone politely knocking at a door. The sound echoed faintly down the shaft, sharp enough to cut through the humming machinery. I stepped closer, craning my head toward the black mouth of the shaft. The smell of grease and dust hung heavy, and the cables disappeared into the darkness above me. I couldn't see anything, but I swear the knocking was coming from just out of sight. I backed away slowly, my work boots scraping against the concrete floor. "Nope," I muttered under my breath, more to myself than anyone else, and I grabbed the bag. I didn't want to be down in that place alone anymore. When I climbed back upstairs, Richard was leaning against the lobby wall, chatting lazily with the manager, like he didn't have a care in the world. He noticed the look on my face right away. "What?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You found something?" I hesitated, then said, No, I thought I heard the elevator move, and I also heard..." I stopped myself, realizing how crazy it would sound. Well, I thought I heard something, like knocking from the shaft. Richard rolled his eyes and let out a short laugh. Kid, every basement and every building makes noises. Pipes knock, gears shift, and wood settles. You'll drive yourself insane if you jump at every sound down there. The building manager gave me a strange look, but didn't say anything. Richard just smirked, clapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Congratulations, rookie. You've officially got basement fever. Happens to all of us at some point. Now, come on, let's get to it." Richard wasn't in a rush, but eventually he gave in and told me to grab the tools and follow him up to the 12th floor, where the car was last reported to stall. The building manager trailed behind us, complaining about tenants threatening to break the lease if the elevator wasn't fixed soon. I barely listened. My mind was stuck in the basement, on those 3 deliberate knocks. The 12th floor hallway was deserted. Most of the offices had their lights off, and only a few muffled voices carried from behind closed doors. Richard pried open the elevator panel with a screwdriver and started flipping breakers, muttering to himself. Relay shot. We'll pull the car down manually and reset. Easy job." He looked at me. "Go open the door. Make sure she's where I think she is." I swallowed hard, walking to the elevator. I forced the metal doors open with the tool key. The car wasn't there. Just a dark shaft yawning back at me, cables stretching down into blackness. "She's a floor up," Richard said, barely glancing at it. "We'll bring it down." As he fiddled with the panel, I leaned a little too close to the edge of the shaft. My flashlight beam barely reached the bottom, but for a split second, I thought I saw movement, like someone leaning just out of the light, pressed against the wall. I blinked and shone the beam again, but everything was back to normal. Just dust motes drifting in the air, I tried to rationalize to myself. "Back up, rookie," Richard barked. "You fall in there, I'm not dragging your sorry butt out." I muttered an apology and stepped back. He got the car moving again, cables whining overhead. Slowly it descended until the car came into view. When it did, my chest tightened when I saw the doors. There were handprints on them. Not greasy smudges or the usual prints you see from people leaning against metal. These were clear, dark, almost oily. Small hands, large hands, too many to count. Dozens of palms and fingers smeared across the silver surface. I was staring in shock, but Richard barely looked up. "Vandals, tenants' kids probably. People make a mess, that's life. Grab the cleaner from the bag later." Richard fiddled with the system for a while longer, until it was fixed. He gave the elevator a few runs up and down to be sure. Since the elevator was secure in place by then, I decided to step in after the doors opened when it was back on our level. I got in and turned around towards the door. But the hallway I was looking at then was no longer the 12th floor. It was quick, maybe a few seconds, but I swear it was real. It felt real. Instead of seeing Richard and the 12th floor, I was staring down a corridor I didn't recognize. The walls were raw concrete, damp and unfinished, and a row of bare bulbs swung from the ceiling on chains. At the end of the hall, something dark shifted just out of sight, making every hair on my body stand upright. Then, as if it never happened, the 12th floor was back. Office hallway, beige carpet, flickering lights. Richard stepped inside without hesitation while I stood frozen on the threshold. "You coming or are you planning to daydream all night?" he snapped. We spent another half hour checking wiring and running tests, but I barely absorbed a word of it. My mind kept replaying those 3 seconds in the doorway. The concrete, the swinging bulbs, that shape at the end of the hall. When Richard finally packed up, we rode the elevator back down together. He cracked jokes about rookie nerves, but I couldn't bring myself to laugh. The car shuddered as it descended, lights buzzing faintly overhead. For a brief moment, the old floor indicator glitched, skipping from 10 straight to B2. "There's no basement 2, I whispered. Richard smacked the panel with his palm, and the display corrected itself. "Old system, don't read too much into it. We can fix her up, but we ain't doing more than what we're getting paid to do." Normally I would laugh, but I couldn't shake the cold weight in my stomach. When the doors opened in the lobby, I was the first one out. The building manager thanked us and promised to mail the check to us. But I barely heard him. Richard was still cracking jokes, telling me to get some sleep and stop watching horror movies. I didn't argue. But as we left, I glanced back one last time at the elevator. Its doors were just closing, like it had been waiting for us to finally finish. And just before they shut completely, I swear I heard it again. 3 faint knocks. After that day, we thankfully weren't scheduled for that building again. Whether the elevator ran perfectly after we left, or they found another company, I don't know. And I wasn't all that keen on returning back and finding out. I told Richard it gave me headaches, that the smell in the basement made me sick. Then he called me soft, but he let it go. Years passed since then, and I don't work on elevators anymore. I tried to push all that from my mind, but sometimes when I ride elevators alone, even in shopping malls or hospitals, I catch myself staring at the panel and the doors, waiting to see those black handprints or a floor number that is not supposed to be there. Some things are best left unseen. From the Silent Cypher. During COVID, I went on a ghost tour of my hometown. It was a bicycle tour at night, and we visited some old buildings in town, learning about the history and some hair-raising stories from around the place. Personally, I knew some haunted places that are not on the tour. Growing up, we had some scary experiences both in school and the hostel we stayed in. Even the place I rent currently is haunted. The activity got worse after my dad died, and we had to resort to placing Bibles in every room just for things to quiet down, which it eventually did. After I moved here, I started to think back to all my haunted experiences, and I began to wonder what exactly my first paranormal encounter was. I'm working as an admin at a car parts shop, and it gets really quiet some days. That's when I popped my earphones in and tuned into some music or podcasts. I could sometimes hear someone moving objects at the back, and I know darn well there was nobody back there. The building is very old, and the bricks are crumbling. The music drowns those noises out and calms my nerves. Then I stumbled upon this show, and something amazing happened. Somewhere between the podcast, the car parts, and the camera keeping an eye on everything, I started to remember things from back in the day. More specifically, the car parts shop my dad worked at. The one that was haunted, and I didn't realize it until later. I wasn't sure if this was the first paranormal event I'd experienced, so I had to start a timeline of everything I saw over the years. I even went on Google Earth to look at the location, just to see if I remember more of what went on there. I went to look at some others as well, since one has already been demolished, so it was impossible to visit in real life. I was around 8 or 9 years old when this occurred, so being in my 30s now, I think it's safe to say my memory here is a bit foggy. Back in the day, I had this old mixtape my dad made in the 80s. Back then, his pickup had a cassette player, and that cassette was one of his favorites. I just knew it would trigger some memories listening to it on Spotify. When I was a kid, my dad wanted to move back to Georgia. He thought there would be better work opportunities there, and that an urban lifestyle would do me good, since I grew up on a farm and didn't have any friends back then. After a rough start, he landed a job as a manager at a scrapyard. My dad had previously been a farm manager, and being Generation X, he knew about cars. It was like it was in his genes. At first, I only knew 1 or 2 of his colleagues. Jerry was a lot like my dad. He had a skinny build with short blonde hair and a mustache. He wore chinos with button-up shirts and he smoked cigarettes. My dad was more or less the same. The only difference seemed to be that my dad had blackish hair and wore glasses when doing paperwork. Dan, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. The man rocked a bow tie, and when he wasn't assisting customers at the front desk, he was stuffing his face. He was closest to the kitchen, after all. He was mostly deep inside a newspaper whenever I saw him, always on the lookout for some good deals in the advertisement section. These guys were old school. In their minds, there was no such thing as ghosts. It was just stories to scare children. I would later find out my dad could see things, but he never spoke about it, as it was considered a taboo topic back then. Now, George is located in South Africa near the south coast. It gets regular rainfall and the ground never really gets completely dry. Sometimes it will rain for days on end. The region around George is a lush green forest, and the farmers grew some pretty big vegetables in the area. Yet, at the scrapyard, the ground always seemed dead, and the grass yellowed despite the constant rainfall. The scrapyard itself was an interesting place. It was located in the industrial district and was one of about 20 similar businesses in the area. People were towing cars that were involved in road accidents, and after a certain period of time elapsed, the business could strip those cars for spares and sell them. It had a storefront and the actual parts were stocked in the back. The storage area was 3 times bigger than the storefront. It was also not that well lit, and so it was kind of creepy, to be honest. The whole building is basically a warehouse that had been sectioned off and the roof was at least 2 stories high. There were bigger doors that could be opened, but they were kept closed when not enough people were on site to monitor them. That place got extra dark on rainy days, and the random chains that still hung from these supports didn't help with the eerie atmosphere. At the back, there were old car bodies scattered throughout the overgrown yard. They were completely stripped and would sometimes have more dents and paint on them. Regardless, there was always somebody building up a car from scratch and in need of a car body that they could repair. The issue that the owners had was that they had run out of space, and they had no idea what they had in stock. My dad started to identify parts and mark them with markers to make it easier to associate parts with items listed on their sheets. He had to resort to pesticides to get rid of the grass. Then they had to borrow a crane to start moving the cars. He wanted to stack some bodies on top of others to save space, and then have the cars in lines so that it was easier to keep track of and remove a body when a customer came knocking. It wasn't long before they realized that the camera started to trigger a lot more. It was one of those security systems that only recorded whenever movement was detected, and the screen only showed one camera at a time. You had to cycle through them to view other cameras. At the time, they thought it might be a stray cat or another animal that might have had its habitat disturbed during all the moving. If it was an intruder, they would have no way of catching the person, as the yard was too big to catch up to anyone before they could jump a fence. My mom also worked during that time, since life in George was way more expensive than we initially thought. My brother was a few months old, and my parents had it tough with him being placed in daycare. My grandma used to babysit me after school until my dad came to pick me up. Then my grandmother died suddenly, and my dad had me put in the after-schools program, where there were dedicated personnel making sure we ate and did homework until our parents came to pick us up. However, there was no one else that could watch me on Saturdays, so I had to go to work with my dad. That is where I met the rest of Dad's colleagues. There was also their admin lady, Barbara, who I rarely saw since she only seemed to work half days. There was another guy called William, who just started working there as well. I knew him somewhat since he helped my dad some Saturday afternoons for some extra income. My dad and Barbara were the only people with offices. My dad shared his with Jerry, and it was quite spacious. It had a drywall lower half with glass panels from waist height to the ceiling. This gave a good view of these surroundings, and my dad could keep an eye from his office while doing paperwork. The office had storage cabinets in the back and a monitor for the security system. I liked the office, since I could sit and draw in there. I must have wasted a lot of paper, because my dad stopped me and gave me a job to do at one point. It was one of those special jobs that parents gave children to keep them out of trouble. He wanted me to keep an eye on the security cameras and to tell him if the screen turned on. They were working skeleton staff on Saturdays, and most people were not in. William was there because he had some unfinished work to take care of. Barbara didn't work Saturdays, and the mechanics didn't show up either. The owners almost never stayed at the shop, since they were farmers, and the shop was more of a side business to them. It was a quiet Saturday morning, so there wasn't much activity on the camera, when out of nowhere it detected movement coming on. At first, when it turned on, my dad was nowhere to be found, but eventually I found him. I told him it had come on. He told me it had probably detected him, but I said that I hadn't seen him on the camera. He explained that the camera sometimes takes a while to turn on, so it could have detected me before he walked off screen. It happened again after roughly half an hour. This time my dad scolded me, since everyone was present at the time, and the camera could not have detected anything. Then it happened again. This time when I called my dad, he was just in time to see the camera screen turn off. He pressed a button and rewound the footage. However, we didn't see anyone on that footage. Well, Dad had gotten worried that someone was stealing from the shop. There were some items stored outside that disappeared from time to time, and he was starting to wonder if it wasn't maybe someone who knew the camera's blind spots. However, he and Jerry were frequently in and out of the building, and had never seen anything weird so far. When the screen lit up again, my dad stood watching it with me. We didn't see anything. So we had Jerry go outside to inspect the area, but even he found nothing. He came back in and reported that everything looked the same. However, as he was standing there, the camera turned on again, and all three of us stood watching at basically nothing. My dad and Jerry exchanged nervous glances, and we never spoke directly about these incidents again. We became good friends with William and his family over the next year. He had a younger brother my age, and we had a fun childhood together. However, there was something off about William's family. When we would visit them, they would look at the watches, and then like clockwork, everyone was suddenly tired, and they couldn't get us out of the door soon enough. We thought that maybe we were always overstaying our welcome, so we began to visit less frequently. Later they would tell us this wasn't the case. They were just tired. William's brother John invited me over for a sleepover one time, and his mom was not happy about this. Eventually we wore her down and she did agree, and I stayed over. John had this grin on his face that told me he was up to something. And something was definitely off. But we trusted them. After all, his mom babysat my brother quite often, so my parents weren't worried about me. What struck me as strange was that this family was living in a 10-bedroom house, yet there were 7 of them, and only slept in 3 bedrooms. The young sister slept in her mom's room, and the 3 brothers shared a room. The grandparents had their own room and insisted on keeping a light on in the hallway. They were very strict about being in bed before 9 in the evening. I soon realized there were these sounds coming from the other side of the house. Everyone was in their rooms, so this made no sense at all. Then I could hear things being moved and footsteps in the kitchen area. I was still trying to figure out who it was when I realized those footsteps were coming down the hall. I was sleeping near the door, so whoever it was had to walk past me. John had insisted earlier that the door remain open. I never got to see who it was walking about their house. The sound faded in front of the door of our room and went quiet. I thought this was strange, and I told my mom about it the next day. She confronted John and William's mom about what was going on. Apparently, she was ironing alone one day at home. She heard someone behind her and thought one of her boys was trying to prank her. But as she looked up and glanced at the mirror in front of her, she saw something that gave her the fright of her life. She said that behind her, only a few steps away, stood a woman. This woman was bloody and pale, and she was missing her head and an arm. She disappeared as soon as she appeared, and upon discussing this with the family, it turned out that the grandparents had seen this entity before as well. However, they didn't want to spook anybody, so they kept it to themselves and started to keep a Bible open, praying to keep the spirit at bay. They also kept that light on so they wouldn't see this entity standing in the hallway in the dark. Evidently, this was when they started to notice weird things happening in the house that they hadn't been paying attention to before. As it turns out, the house they were living in was built on top of a graveyard, as was our house, since the entire neighborhood used to be that graveyard. When my mom told me this, I realized how many things adults hid from children. Evidently, my thoughts went back to the camera incident at my dad's work. Maybe we had a ghost triggering the cameras, and no one wanted to acknowledge it. Maybe they thought the problem would go away if we just ignored it. My dad would quit that job about a year later, and I never went back there again. To this day, I still wonder whether that was a ghost or something else, maybe something even more sinister. Either way, I'm glad that my friend's mom put that light on that night. Maybe it scared the ghost away. And to this day, I'm very thankful that I haven't directly seen any ghosts. Demonic Demolition. From Jordyn. Working in water damage and mold abatement, I saw a lot of old houses. Many were decades behind in maintenance. One in particular was the oddest house I'd ever seen. Bits and pieces of the house were old, and others modern. The most damaged pieces of the house were the walls that separated old and modern. A wall between a new bedroom and the untouched master bedroom, the pool house wall that attached to the new pool house bathroom, and the wall that separated the old master bedroom from the refurbished master bedroom. It was as though the house itself was rejecting everything new, like a body rejecting surgery. The least unsettling room was the living room near the front door. My Catholic GM refused to even park his vehicle on the property. He asked me one day if I believed in ghosts. I told him yes, but that I believed myself to be spiritually protected. I wasn't a Christian, but I followed the teachings of my Native American family. He had apparently asked my coworker too. We'll call him Jack for the story. And my coworker had stated that he was an atheist and believed nothing happened after we died. A week later, Jack and myself were assigned the assessment and demolition of this job site. We started early in the morning after stopping at a gas station for breakfast. We parked in front of the house, and my eyes nearly popped out of my head. The place was massive, too large to be considered a normal house, a tad too small to be a mansion, but it sat on a large plot of land, had an oasis-style backyard with a huge, irregularly shaped pool with a built-in bridge and its very own pool house. The first oddity to happen was the birds. Upon arriving, we inspected the house. It seemed like every door had a different key, and we moved slowly as we figured out what key went where. Finally, as we crossed the bridge of the pool to assess the pool house, it happened. A dove flew around us in a close circle, cooing madly at us, as if it was protecting something. Then it flew headfirst with a loud thump into the brick exterior to the pool house, killing itself instantly. Jack had a weak stomach and begged me to give the bird a proper burial. I found a soft spot of land in the backyard to the side of the pool house, and I did just that. Jack was shaken up from there and started to report a feeling of unease on the property. I asked if he wanted to start in the main house instead, closer to the van. He agreed and we went back in. We started with the largest of the projects, the master bedroom wall. Before long, we were listening to music, being goofballs, and meticulously demolishing water-damaged sheetrock. We then noticed something odd about the wall. Behind the sheetrock was a layer of brick. Out of curiosity, I measured the wall. I then measured the wall and closet of the other room and the hallway. There was enough space there for an entire other room. I felt it in my heart that something was sealed within those bricks. Unease spread through me like wildfire. I closed the closet and the smaller bedroom's door. As soon as the damaged sheetrock was all torn out and bagged up, we walked the trash to the van and grabbed the shop vac. On our way back inside, we noticed the next odd issue. When we had walked the trash out, the other bedroom doors were closed, as were the closets in them. We knew this because it was a part of our walkthrough to check them, and after measuring the room, Jack had watched me close the closet and smaller bedroom door again. We walked out of the house with the trash together, and we walked in with the shop vac together. The room just before the master bedroom was now open, as was the closet. Jack dropped the shop vac and started to tremble. I assured him it was probably just a mistake. Perhaps we had forgotten to close that room up after inspection. I myself started to feel as if I was being watched. A copper antenna hung loosely around my neck. Without meaning to, I found myself grasping it here and there as we continued to work. We left the master bedroom door wide open as we began vacuuming the debris of demolition. Something did not like this. As I picked up tools and as Jack vacuumed, something turned the vacuum off. Neither of us were near the vacuum. Jack started to panic. Something in me became enraged. I remember getting so angry with whatever it was messing with us. I remember an odd protective feeling I had for the shorter, dainty man I was working with. Jack reported that I had growled while staring at the open door near the vacuum before I stalked forward and shouted, "You're not welcome here! I command you leave us be!" And for a few hours it did exactly that. It left us alone. I then moved deeper into the massive master bedroom to quickly rip out the minor bits of mold spores in the master bathroom. One moment, something told me to look at Jack. I looked up from my work, and I saw him across the room from me, still a good distance from the door. Then he fell to his hind end and screamed as the door to the master bedroom slammed shut out of nowhere, from a wide open position. The door knocked the shop vac clear across the room, almost hitting Jack. Now, it wasn't nighttime at the time. It was not a spooky midnight occurrence. This was going on in the middle of the day. Anger welled up in me again as Jack scrambled to his feet to hide behind me. But before anything could happen, he tugged on my shirt and begged me not to yell at it again. I calmed myself. Then Jack asked if he could go start on the pool house while I finished cleaning up the master bedroom. I agreed to that. I felt as if I wasn't the one being targeted here, and so perhaps him being out of the room would solve the situation. Just as I was finishing the cleaning of the master bedroom, another bird smacked headfirst into the big bay window, snapping its neck. I cursed to myself. I was startled. Before I could do anything else, there was this whimper at the bedroom door behind me. The hair on the back of my neck rose, and I slowly turned around. Jack stood in the doorway, his hand dripping blood. His eyes were clouded over like he wasn't actually awake. A trail of blood droplets and splatter led behind him. I remember saying his name, and for a few moments he would not respond. He only stared forward in a lost daze. Eventually, I slung the small man up in my arms and carried him out of the house, back to the van. His conscious mind returned the minute I carried him over the threshold of the house's front door. He then proceeded to have a panic attack. He begged me not to leave him. He pleaded for me to keep holding him to protect him. I addressed his wound on the back of his hand. He didn't even remember how it happened, or where he was going or what he was doing. The man didn't even remember leaving the master bedroom to start in the pool house. I used clean water and rinsed his wound. It didn't need stitches, thankfully, but it was fairly deep. I bandaged it for him, and I told him to stay in the van. He clung to me like a child until I assured him I would be right back. I cleaned up the blood trail, finishing the demolition in the pool house and cleaning the mess as I went. In all, it took about 30 minutes. I was working as quickly as I could, and none of the other work was nearly as much as the massive wall in the master bedroom. When I returned to the van, 3 more doves lay dead upon the ground. Smudges along the side of the van showed where they had killed themselves. Jack was curled into a ball on the floorboard, with his hands covering his ears. I threw everything into the van, and I drove us away from that house. Later, when I got back home, I told my wife everything that had happened, and she had me smudge myself and our own house. Nothing further happened to me. But Jack, well, Jack was never the same. He became almost manic. Talking to him was like talking to a completely different person. I caught him staring a few times at nothing or talking to himself. Once, I swear, he answered himself in a completely different voice. Jack started distancing himself from me. He went from being my best friend at work to acting like he hated me, like he couldn't stand to be around me. That ball of energy that always sang in the van with me, always found ways to make work fun, was withdrawn. Then one day he stopped showing up to work. He stopped answering any phone calls or texts. My boss called for a welfare check on him, and the police found him in his home alive and well. But the officer looked shaken when he reported back. I wanted so desperately to know what the officer had seen, so I went to see for myself. At Jack's house, he didn't answer the door. I didn't like that, so I walked around the side of the house. I was shocked. Dead doves littered the ground around the building. I looked into his living room window, and I saw him lying there on the ground. He was talking to himself again. He was already a petite man, but now he was skin and bones. Then I saw the scabbed wounds, one in the center of each palm, mirroring one on the back of his hand, and the same on his feet, like the stigmata. His eyes were bruised and sunken into his skull, like he had never known a minute of sleep, the outline of his ribs. Then he looked right up at me and gave me a grin I still see in my nightmares. I smudged myself and my home again that day. I never again saw him or heard from Jack. Chinese Takeout. From Michelle. Having grown up in a haunted neighborhood, I wasn't shocked or confused when weird things happened. Nothing truly dangerous had ever happened with any of my childhood experiences. Just a shock, a shiver, make sure it's not a critter and move on, those types of things. So when I turned 16 and went to work in the only Chinese restaurant in our small town at the time, I wasn't expecting the oddness to continue. This restaurant was fairly typical compared to what I later observed in other similar places. Dark, lots of deep red colors, low-volume Chinese music piping in. It was located in a strip mall off the main highway. It had a big wide-open parking lot with unevenly spaced lights that left too much shadow between them. Some of the spots were so dark that between the storefront and the road, it seemed more like voids than just shadowy areas. The sidewalks were lit, a soft orange glow that didn't extend much past the edge of the concrete. Due to the heavy, deep red draperies in the restaurant's windows, no interior light spilled out. Like many strip mall designs, this sidewalk could become a wind tunnel that would yank a door out of your hands if you weren't paying attention. The wind, in fact, was one of the reasons we almost always checked the door when customers left, unless it was a really busy time of day. From the front door, you could draw a straight line through the swinging door to the kitchen and down the hallway past the bathrooms and out the single back door. That's 1 minute or less from the front door and out the back. Not a big place at all. During daylight hours, the place was warm and cheery. Morning hours brought in your regular customers on their lunch breaks. It wasn't necessarily packed, but it was steady. Being in high school at the time, I only got to see this on the weekend day shifts I could pick up. Tips, though, are always better at night when you have larger groups or just many more people coming in for dinner out. So I preferred to work evenings. Now, except on the weekends, this was a one-person job. Monday through Thursday, I could work by myself and have truly little trouble with the workload. In the back would be one cook, who was also the owner, and he may have one helper that would be a member of his family. The front door had an electric chime attached that would ding in the back when it was opened. If the cook didn't have help, and I stepped in to clean or prep, this little ding would help me know to get back out front and greet our guests. Once you got the guests seated and drinks made, all waitstaff would make a swing by the front door to make sure the latch was engaged. The door being violently thrown open by the wind had happened to all of us enough to make this an ingrained habit. You did the same thing after the customers left. Fortune cookie, goodbye, check the door. This ingrained OCD-ish habit was why it was so strange to hear that ding and turn around to see no one there. I'd be in the back wiping down the soda machine and hear the door chime. I would step out the swinging door to find no one standing there or heading to their favorite seats. Okay, so maybe someone opened the door and realized they were in the wrong place and backed out. That could happen. I'm sure a few times it had, and we would just brush it off. This kept happening, though. Only once when there were customers in the store while I was there. I was there beside the table setting down the drinks, and the doorbell chimed. I looked up to say I'll be right there, and nothing. Possible fault door chime? Always possible. If so, it was the most erratic, only after dark, electric fault I could imagine. Then there were the times the door would actually open. This one would even unnerve the customers. The door wouldn't burst open like someone forgot to shut it completely. No, this was the deliberate open. Wait the 2 counts while you walk in, and gently shut the door behind you kind of opening and closing. That extra push, hear the snick, and wait to be seated. Only there would be no one standing there. Many times I would walk to the door and pull back the curtains and look out to see no one. Now remember I told you the parking lot was dark. True, if this person was walking, they would have to sprint into the darkness to get past the first row of lights or in a vehicle running with no lights and using no brakes. Customers in view of the door would sit and stare like, well, that's odd, give an uncomfortable chuckle, and quickly finish eating. Darkness brought a darkness, so completely different than the daytime hours, it was dizzying. At that time, the shops closest by the restaurant close early, maybe 6 p.m. at the latest. We stayed open until 9 p.m., Sunday through Thursday, and 10 p.m. on Friday and Saturday. The chime and door thing became normal. Yeah, something likes to play with the door, big deal. It isn't hurting anything or making a mess, so check the door and continue. I guess we may have gotten too comfortable with it, too complacent, and our visitor decided to step it up a notch. Now, occasionally when the door opens, something would come in. This was almost always when there was at least one table seated. A shadow, maybe, a dark, foggy, shapeless form. No one could ever decide exactly how to describe it. I remember one couple explaining to me how a medium-sized dog, but not really a dog, had come in and went under one of the booths in the corner. The woman was really distressed about it. She had been facing the door, and because of the low lighting in the room and the long red tablecloths, I had to grab a flashlight to check under the booths, thinking someone may have let a dog in. But I found nothing. That doesn't mean I didn't see for myself the little formless dark shape peek around the corner at me. There's a screened half wall around the doorway. If anyone taller than a small child walked in, you'd see them unless they were crawling. So the door opens and closes. No people walk in. Then about 2, maybe 3 feet off the floor, you see a faceless dark shape peeking around the corner. I can tell you it was really difficult to muster up the nerve to walk forward and check to make sure the door was latched. I'd get within a few feet and just go rigid. It was more comfortable to step behind the register, so there was at least something between you and whatever that was. On every occasion, there would be nothing there. No shadow, no child, a peek out the curtains, and no one outside the door that may have opened it. The register was on a cabinet with 2 shelves behind it. One held menus and the other was the stock napkins and silverware wraps for the tables. It wasn't deep, just 1.5 feet or so. One night after closing, I was counting down the register. Something wrapped a hand around my knee. It wasn't cold, and it didn't hurt. But when you're standing alone behind a solid piece of wood, and a hand that is not yours takes a hold of your leg, well, heart failure due to shock seems a more threatening possibility. A few times there would be whispers, voices just barely audible enough to make you wonder if they were bleeding in from outside or from the kitchen. I could never make out the words. The cook never called for me, and he didn't speak English. He had a bell he'd ring when my orders were ready. Besides that, it was just pointing and going, "Yeah, yeah," because that's all he knew. The ambient music was so normal by now that you only noticed it when it was suddenly cut off. But this little voice in particular was speaking words too low to make out. I can't remember if at the time it seemed male or female. I just remember setting tables and hearing a voice. I even turned and said, "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Only to find an empty room. I remember the door hadn't opened yet, neither the front nor the squeaky swinging door in the kitchen. Sometimes that whisper seemed more felt than heard. I'm not sure exactly how to explain it. You could feel like you heard something. Your mind is suddenly busy trying to decipher the words before your ears or any other sense recognizes that they've been spoken. And you could tell when the customers heard it too. That quick look behind them over to an empty booth. No one ever asked me what was going on. I guess they were embarrassed to admit they were hearing things. Sometimes I would see a patron look at me, kind of wide-eyed. I'd shrug, and they would just raise their voices a little and pretend it didn't happen. The last occasion I witnessed something unexplainable in this restaurant was right before a tanning salon moved in next door. The only brightly lit area of the dining room was the register. There were track lights mounted there so you could clearly see to pay. There was a 5x12 rectangular plexiglass window in the swinging door, so you didn't walk into other servers coming out. You could also see the reflection of the room behind you as you were entering that door, if the hallway lights in the back were already cut off. All this time I'd been thinking of our little precocious visitor as a small, almost childlike thing. What I saw as I was leaving the room, reflected in the window of the door, was tall, shadowed with no distinct features. The perfect outline of a large man with wide shoulders and head tilted forward. I almost ran completely out the back door at that point. I called the cook's wife at home and told her there was someone in the dining room and that she needed to explain to her husband so he could go look. Again, he had unbelievably bad English at the time. He looked at me, kind of shocked, then went out the door and I followed. He first checked the front door and checked that it was locked. He walked the entire room and looked under the booths. Nothing. He shook his head and said no, then went back to the kitchen. Shortly after that, the tanning salon opened. They stayed open each evening a little later than we did. Our door quit opening on its own. The bell quit dinging without opening. There were no more shadows or whispers. It was amazing. I went to the tanning bed a few times, only a few. I never could get over the feeling of being watched. I think our little friend liked this place much better than a lonely Chinese restaurant. You know what I took away from this episode? That I'm apparently craving some Chinese food. That's what happens when you fall off your diet hard and gain 15 pounds over the course of a few months. Good Lord, I need help. Corporate is getting real suspicious regarding how we're selling out of all our croissants the first day they arrive. Sweet, buttery croissants. Good night. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tales from the Break Room. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can find me on X at Dark Prevails, and discussing paranormal and creepy things in an adult manner on my new comedy show, Night Watchers, on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We're also on YouTube at Night Watchers Podcast. Till next time, everyone, stay clear of any suspicious elevators, and especially any elevators I might be on. I'm starting to scare that weight limit.